Welcome to Transforming Work with Sophie Wade, exploring the future of work. Find out what's going on in our multi-generational distributed organizations. With a new tech and talent focus, discover what you need to know to stay upskilled and relevant and ensure your business keeps its competitive edge.
Hi. This episode is about leading a multi-generational workforce and how to improve collaboration, performance, and outcomes across and within teams where there may be large and small age gaps. There are some significant multi-generational issues. For example, almost half of US hiring managers find Generation Z the hardest to work with. And over a quarter of them actually avoid recruiting Gen Z. But this cannot be a long-term solution for your company. Not trying to understand and integrate the engine of future growth for your business. All generations need to be able to work together effectively, which starts with how to adjust how you communicate, compromise, and set context as a leader. I'm delighted to be discussing these issues with Kamber Parker Bowden, CEO and founder of Generational Performance Solutions, which helps companies close workforce gaps, improve cross-generational communication, and future-proof their leadership pipelines. Hi, Kamber. How are you?
I'm great, Sophie. Thank you so much for having me.
So, want to dive right in. You started studying communications, is that correct?
Yes, communication studies and political science, actually. I really wanted to be a broadcast journalist. And parts of what that job consists of, I think we can tie it into some of the work that I do now. But that was what I really thought I was going to study in college.
Okay. And how did that evolve? What was the particular focus that you wanted to do with political science?
Well, if you go back all the way to fourth grade, I remember, I'm really taking it back.
That's good.
I remember doing a project on Katie Couric. And for a long time, I just loved her. And probably at the time when this assignment came up in fourth grade, I was like, I'm going to do a report on her. And I just remember having this long-standing fixation with the, becoming a news anchor. I thought that I could get my start in broadcast journalism. And I got to college. I grew up in Maryland, but I came down to South Carolina to go to school. And I just realized about a year in that it was not the lifestyle I wanted. And I fell in love with networking. I fell in love through a series of internships that I had, but I fell in love with the concept of networking. Being a broadcast journalist would mean that I would have some weird hours and then I'd have to miss all of this stuff. And I know that sounds really funny and kind of naive now, but that was ultimately what kind of started helping me build my network while in college and has since really helped me in growing my business. So it all kind of ties back to this, but that was kind of the start, the impetus, if you will.
I think these epiphanies that one has about oneself are always very helpful. You started in communications out of college.
Yeah. So what's funny is the job I had after college is vastly different from what I had started, which was working in corporate insurance that I never thought I would do, but it was a Fortune 500 huge insurance company. And I jumped in right after school. I was 21 and I left after 10 months. It was not the job for me. I am sure you've seen just in your work, there are at many of these Fortune 100, 500 companies, they have leadership rotation programs, and that's all the rage. So I joined one of these rotation programs and it wasn't the right fit for me. And so I started my entire business because of that first experience where I left. Yeah. So I left my job. I was like, why are all my friends also leaving their jobs after 6, 12, 18 months? This is not the narrative. And I'm a millennial. So I was very much part of that millennial job hopping craze that was pre-pandemic. And so that's kind of where my story, honestly, my professional journey begins, which was funny because, trajectories are really fascinating to me. And without that first job, who knows where I would be? I don't think my business would be what it is today. And so I'm very grateful that I had that experience. But it,
Sure.
the news anchor piece really got missed in the puzzle.
I have very specific opinions about the job hopping, or that job hopping label, which I do not think is correct.
Mm-hmm.
But you were in it. You felt that you had hopped in your job, or hopped out of your job, and you had friends who were doing the same. So what was it that you felt that they were doing, or what did you discover that they were doing and felt for yourself? And what were the next steps after that, when you realized, okay, so that wasn't for me, but there's something more than this? And how did that get you started on the next steps?
When I left, I really remember I was devastated, right? Like my whole college career, I was like, I'm going to make it. I'm going to climb the corporate ladder. This is what I'm going to do. And I went in with some very high and what I like to call false expectations.
Okay.
I didn't know it at the time, but now based on the work that I do and the interviews we've done with thousands of young professionals, we have identified that it almost always comes down to a couple of things. One, it's communication. Two, it is expectations and how clear the expectations are when you're hiring somebody to come in the workforce.
Sure.
Are you being authentic? Are you being honest with these people? And then also to the young or experienced professionals who are seeking these jobs, like, are you being honest with yourself, right? Are you looking at the company just as closely as the company is looking at you?
Sure.
What was I noticing about my peers who were job hopping at the time and their peers? And it really comes down to, they all went into their first or second jobs with one expectation, and the reality was very different from that. And so I think that's the simplest way I can put it, but I would love to hear your perspective.
So I guess my second question before I answer, because I think it's really important to understand the perspective of millennials and also Gen Zs later, as to why you didn't feel, okay, I'm going to stick it out for a year or longer, and nor did your friends.
Yeah, so I'll speak to my experience first. But when I left, I was making a lot of money out of school. I was like, compared to all my friends, like I was in a solid benefits and salaried position, right? I had zero work-life balance, which I know, we can dive into that term all we want, but there wasn't any flexibility. I was killing myself. My mental, physical, emotional health was really poor. And I also had moved to a city where I knew no one. And that was really important to me. What was missing was important to me. And I mean, I was 21, 22 at the time, and that mattered to me. And I actually left to go work. I moved back to Greenville, which is where I went to school, South Carolina. And I actually took a pretty significant pay cut, which we see and hear often with younger workers, to a 2-person at the time nonprofit. And I worked in fundraising, and for 5 years, I switched. So again, thinking of my trajectory, I switched course quite literally. And in that experience, I had so much growth. I had unlimited potential to grow with the organization as we hired new people and we worked with new partners. I learned new skills, and I had the utmost flexibility, which allowed me to build my business for 5 years, right?
Right. Because I saw you doing those at the same time. Yeah.
I was, yeah. And I started my business actually while the tail end of my first career. And it was just a side hobby, a passion project for 2 years.
Right.
But when I moved to the fundraising job, it kind of took off. I left what a lot of people are like, that's stable. That's a stable, secure job. And I left because nothing was going to, unless they could offer me that, that was the only thing that would keep me there. And I recognized that at a young age that was what I was looking for. And so a lot of young professionals' stories are very similar to that. And unfortunately, so many companies put so much effort into the recruiting and not as much on the growth, the development, the retention, the activation of talent. And I think that's where this company really lost with me. I'd love to hear your thoughts on the job hopping piece. I know you're here to talk to me, but I'd love to hear your perspective too.
There's some great LinkedIn data which shows how hard it is to progress in your career. these days. And that is very much to do with the fact that organizations are flatter. And I do know that insurance companies are extremely flat. Yes. So then you have to move horizontally or diagonally in order to be learning new skills, to be developing. Now, obviously, in a leadership development program, when you have that rotation, those actually can be very useful for learning new skills. Yes. But if you don't have any work-life balance, you're not meeting anybody, and you're having pretty lonely time, that's a whole different matter. Mm-hmm. But the LinkedIn data really shows that this was from the end of 23, and it was the same in 24, that about 20% of Gen Zs, and I think millennials as well, feel that either their boss or their company is helping them progress in their career. And it's very difficult when companies aren't set up for that internal talent mobility. And that really is something that is absolutely necessary now. As I said, companies are flatter. And so these nonlinear careers, which a lot of companies either don't have the mechanism, they don't have the internal marketplace. And they just don't have relationships. A lot of managers need to have the relationships to say, okay, I'm going to let Kamber go off who's a rising star in my team, to go off and work for John or Mary over there. And that I need to get somebody great in return. So, or why would I do that? I want to keep her on my team because she's good for me and she's good for my results. So there are a lot of things that need to happen to facilitate that internal mobility. And if they don't have that, then it's like, well, I actually need to leave in order to progress my career, in order to, if I can't get new skills, I can't get new training, at least have a new experience. So that's what I do see as being a cause, one of the big causes of a lot of the job hopping. And the other thing, which I'm very curious as to how you feel about both millennials and Gen Z's desires both for skills, but also for careers. So with so many jobs appearing out of nowhere, AI skills related, a different, particular sector or some type of operations is changing dramatically, and that's creating new jobs. I have seen many younger millennials and Gen Zs not making any decisions about their career because they're waiting to see what happens, how it evolves, what new jobs are coming up. So that makes it more of I'm going to not hop around in my job, but I'm going to explore. I don't know what's going to happen, but I'm going to develop new skills. Taking all this career development, these career development challenges and the skills, which are so important to millennials and Gen Zs for the competitiveness, for their career growth, for the salary growth, all of those different types of things, as well as that flexibility. How are you helping communicate to both millennials and Gen Zs, but also older generations, about how careers have changed?
First, thank you for answering my question, because I think your perspective is so valuable, and I just really love hearing your take on the generations in the workforce. So thank you. There's a lot of things to kind of unpack about what you just shared. And
if you think I'm wrong anywhere, please let me know.
No. Having a healthy discussion about all of this, because there's so much, let's be honest, there's a lot out there about generations, right? Yeah. And you have to be really careful about which generational research to trust is how I view it. Because everywhere there's going to be every day there's an article that comes out about generation this, generation that. And so it's great to have conversations about this, and also with people that have, trusted data.
To be absolutely clear, I'm talking more here about where people are in their life arc. I won't even say career arc, because we have so many careers. So it's not about the age. It's kind of like age groups, but it's more, are you early? Are you the beginning of your working life? Are you getting into that sort of prime age, maybe kids, maybe not, a whole different, or a sort of prime or moving on. So that's how I think about it.
Yeah, that's great. And thank you for sharing. There's a few things that I think about when it comes to, one, looking at, how many new jobs there are today. We have many young and kind of more tenured millennials at this point who are starting, if not, they have been in leadership roles for some time. Because of the aging workforce and the declining birth rate, we have this gap, and we have the gap of the transferring of skills from experienced workers to these millennial leaders, soon to be Gen Z leaders who are coming in.
Right.
And we also have a rise in entrepreneurship. We have Gen Zers who, yes, they're exploring jobs, but a lot of the Gen Zers we talk to, if they have the opportunity, they're going to start a side hustle. Like most people have side hustles, and it takes them out of the public and private sector if it does well. And like, hopefully it does so well that it can fuel the economy and drive more jobs. But the reality is, because of all these new jobs that there are today, one of which is the influencer, right? The modern day
the creator
influencer,
economy,
where, I mean, people can, the creator economy, people can, start a side hustle that turns into a successful business. And so young people are seeing that it's easier than ever before. And so that's a whole other lane. And we honestly rarely talk to we rarely talk to any young professionals that either don't have a side hustle or don't have that interest. And I think that is so applicable to the modern workforce today.
A sidebar just on that, because two reasons that I see in the data. One, very importantly, that it's a financial, risk mitigation. I need some more stability. You corporation are giving me no security whatsoever, and you don't even really make me feel, connected, but you expect loyalty. The key thing that I see is that, yes, and okay, I get this job and I get health insurance from it, but what I really want to do is be able to run my life. And if I can run my life and choose how I'm going to live it, and choose that work-life balance, and be able to make some money, doesn't have to be, crazy amounts of money, but you never know, then that's why I'm going to go for the creator economy. So I do see that there's a potential bifurcation in really having a lot of young people, millennials, Gen Zs, wherever, going off in this direction to sort of say, I don't want what you have, because it just doesn't make me feel good. I don't feel that I'm learning. I don't feel I'm trusted. I don't feel that I'm really valued. Is that fair?
It is fair. And, you said trust. And that is another kind of core trait right now that we're seeing with younger workers is there's this lack of trust in the establishment, right? The corporate organizations. And you look at the current climate, and it's really something that a lot of young people are struggling with. And it's like, I think in the narrative online that I see all the time is, there's stability now. Like people are, because of the economy, people are going to stay. And you look at the job market, you look at what is happening right now, and people are saying, there's a pendulum swinging back. And I would love to know your thoughts on this. But what we are hearing is, like, even in a more employer-driven economy where maybe there's less hiring happening and more developing talent, more retaining talent, even in that type of economy, if somebody is not fulfilled, even if they're getting paid what they want to get paid, but they're not fulfilled in other ways and there aren't growth opportunities, they will leave, right? Like that is what we have seen and heard time and time again. And then one other piece, Sophie, based on something that you shared earlier, I have a lot of podcast guests that come on our show who are very different in terms of their backgrounds. But one of the biggest trends that I have heard from our guests across all industries, and I just think is really interesting for this discussion, is they say, the days of keeping somebody at a job 30 years is long gone. I think we've acknowledged that, probably because finding a new job is easier than ever before with technology, and recruiters are also much more aggressive than, how they were 5-10 years ago. So you're seeing, a lot of people take jobs who weren't even looking for jobs in the first place. And so a lot of our guests, they say, and I love this message, it's like, how can we get somebody to be a rock star employee for 3 to 5 years? Like, what would that do for our business versus that 1 year mark, which I'm sure you've seen the stat about half of an employee's salary is lost when they leave after 1 year or less.
Right.
And that, again, what if we could get them past 1 year? Like, what would that look like? And so when you talk about a lot of these younger workers exploring different opportunities, it's like leaders, how can they create this
Exactly.
opportunity for people so that even while they're exploring, we can still give them this amazing experience, and maybe they leave, maybe they stay, but maybe they leave and they could become boomerang employees, right?
Yep, absolutely.
Or they go on and they champion other people and they become indirect recruiters.
The data shows that Gen Zs particularly, for example, are not trying to leave. A lot of them say, I would like to stay 3 or 4 years. However, the importance for them of having be continually acquiring skills so that I can stay competitive, so that I can grow. It's always really top of mind. And of course, one of the things that really leapt out at me about the idea that if you don't know where you're going because all these jobs keep sort of appearing, then upskilling just becomes that much more important. And if an employer is not giving me training and not trying to make sure that I can keep moving, making progress, even if it isn't vertical progress, then I am literally, it doesn't make sense for me to stay. One of the things that I try and communicate is this internal talent mobility is really not easy, particularly for large organizations. And as you know, there is patience if there is transparency. So we are trying to move you to another position, but we haven't been able to do that yet. So I think there is, if their expectations are managed, people will stay if they know that there is this intention. We want to upskill you, we want to give you new experiences. We have to try and make that work over there. And, there are projects that you might be able to do on the side. So to be able to give those side hustles, but within an organization. There are some creative ways that that this can be done. It's just thinking a little differently, because there are many people who still haven't really seen how much that this vertical sort of incremental career ladder is just not there anymore. And just going to that sort of, that 30-year career, there's not a single company who wants those people to stay for 30 years. They don't. I mean, there was this kind of like quid pro quo, we'll guarantee you a job and you will work long, painful hours. Well, if you're not guaranteeing me a job, I'm not going to work long, painful hours.
Yeah.
Right? So it
Absolutely.
really changes so many aspects of this. For millennials, they have a unique role, I think, in terms of being the bridge, with one foot sort of in more traditional ways of working and, in the sort of the office environment, and then also one foot understanding, the younger employees, the newer graduates much more, also having some reactions that are similar to Gen Xers and Boomers. How are you seeing millennials reacting, and how do you react when you hear people saying they're so entitled, those young guys?
So what I have found that's so interesting through our work is millennials really do have this, kind of one foot on one side of the senior experience professional side, and then one side on the Gen Z side of the house, kind of these emerging leaders still. And millennials really were the last generation before Gen Z to experience life before the pandemic, right? Like they were still in those early career years. And then the pandemic hit, and, just about 2 or 3 years of Gen Zers were in the workforce at that point. So millennials kind of, they kind of got it. They experienced the workplace, pre-COVID.
Right.
At the beginning of our work, I started, interviewing young professionals in 2018, excuse me. So, several years at this point. And when I first started, it was primarily millennials in that young professional seat.
Sure.
As Gen Z has emerged in the workplace, millennials are like, do not clump us with them.
What's the particular reaction? I am curious as to what it is that they're saying they're different from us.
Yeah, it had prompted me to say, like, why is that? Right? I'm a millennial. I'm kind of on the tail end of millennials, and that brings up the concept of micro generations, which I do think are very powerful in understanding. Somebody who is a more senior millennial has a very different life experience than the youngest millennial, or they can, right? So kind of going back to your career arcs. But what millennials are saying is they're actually saying that the Gen Zers are entitled. They're lazy. They can't come to work on time. They're not dressing professionally. So millennials are kind of taking the seat of maybe how the baby boomers and maybe the Gen Xers kind of responded to us, the millennials. And so I find that really interesting in terms of how I feel about entitlement. And when I hear that is I always bring it back to generational data. Two things come to mind. One, every single generation that is kind of the youngest or the new kids on the block, they always get looked at through a magnifying glass. Everybody is looking at them, thinking, what can we say about them that's going to help us understand and like make sense of them? But also, what are the things that annoy us about this generation? Even when baby boomers were the first in the workforce, like when they were entering, everybody always has something to say. And I know that you know that. And so with millennials in particular, when I hear they're so entitled, I think it's funny that they're saying that about Gen Z, but I also think that you have to look at how they were raised. You have to look at the environments they came from. Something that I always hear, and I have to say this very sensitively when I'm speaking to audiences made up of senior professionals, people say millennials are the participation trophy generation. Who is giving us the participation trophies, right? Like we have to be what I like to call generationally curious, but it's more than that. It's just being curious. And I think that's a true leadership skill set. As I'm sure you would agree. I mean, it's, thinking of empathy, right?
And I'm curious from your research and from so many conversations from people who aren't necessarily speaking with empathy, but also speaking to some of the younger generations, why do you think they're working in a way that has people calling them lazy? That has generated those comments.
Let's look at millennials and Gen Z, particularly in the last 5 years. We have seen so many millennials who have really taken this flexible work style and kind of run with it. Like a lot of millennials, they want the flexibility, and Gen Z really wants to be back in the office. Like we are seeing hands down that they are craving face-to-face communication. They, meaning Gen Z, they're craving this because so much of their early careers were just, from here up. They were just seeing people through Zoom. And I think we talked about that before. And millennials are like, no, we had that time. Like we're good. We want to be at home. And then I could even argue as you go up in age, Gen Xers are looking for that flexibility as well. Like we talk to so many Gen Xers who are typically caring for younger children and maybe aging parents.
Absolutely.
And they need more flexibility than, the millennial who wants to go take their dog out at work, during lunch. Right. So I think it's interesting when we think career arcs, we think of, different life stages. What is kind of creating these comments about the work ethic of millennials and Gen Zers? And I think it comes down to expectations, right? We've said that a lot today. That's why we focus so much on intergenerational communication. If you understand how people communicate and you're communicating one way that maybe you haven't set the expectation that you're looking for something, and then they don't achieve what you're looking for them to achieve, then naturally the experienced professional is going to say they're entitled, just like the young professional is going to say that they're just grouchy old people. So it's really interesting being in this middle position because I'm hearing both sides really sharing how they truly feel. I was just in Chicago last week speaking to several groups, and I had an elder millennial, he called himself. He was like, I'm a baby boomer. I'm just going to say it. Like, I don't get Gen Z. I don't understand Gen Z. It just goes to show that if there's not clear expectations, then the groups don't know what to do, because my favorite thing to say is common sense is not all that common anymore. And so if you're assuming something, if you know what they say about assumptions.
There are many things that have changed, and looking at so much research about different people's experiences and what those expectations were. Some of that old school, well, that's how I did it, and that was what was expected of me, and I did that. I think we can shift some of that. You're entitled if you expect things without doing anything for it, right? That's the idea. Well, for me, the long-term assumption was I work really long, hard hours to begin with, And ultimately, I'm going to be able to retire with a small nest egg and maybe a gold watch and be able to sort of, sit on the beach somewhere.
Mm-hmm.
That equation doesn't exist at all for Gen Zs and millennials, apart from some resentment. There is like, why would I kill myself now? I'm not going to be working at your company for 30 years. So you're asking me for something which has no long-term rewards for me, certainly not at your organization. So I think that really, really matters. So I think that's where these disconnects are so important to understand. And it's a lot to try and communicate. I think it's very, very hard to get that across, certainly on a daily basis. What are the things that you try and say to help change the people's perspectives about what might feel like entitlement or feel like somebody's asking for something, either way, that isn't justified or appropriate or fair?
So I have learned this kind of the hard way, right? Like in some of my earliest engagements, it's important how you message this to leaders because they have put in the work, right? They are terrified that all of the traditions that they have built, whatever that looks like for them in their organization, they're terrified that that's going to be dismantled and they believe that it's already dismantled by these younger workers. They certainly have the mindset that you just shared. Well, no one was doing this for us, so why should we do this for them? Like they have this immediate mindset of, well, we shouldn't be giving in to these young people. And I think anytime you talk to leaders, sharing data is so valuable. And so my message shifts as the data changes and what the workforce trends look like. And so I typically will share data and I will tell them, I'll express my own frustration that there are all these changes because we have a generationally diverse team. We have a baby boomer, a Gen Xer, we have 3 millennials, 1 Gen Zer. Like
that's very helpful if you can debate all the ideas, right?
Yes. But we also experience the same communication challenges. Even on a 6-person team, I express my own frustration with these leaders, but say, if we don't figure out a way to be generationally curious and understanding that all generations have strengths and they contribute they bring something to the table, that is what will help you get ahead in this transitioning workplace, right? Like there are so many shifts happening and it's only going to continue to advance. And so paying attention to the trends, but also learning which trends to adapt to, is critical for these leaders. And I always ask them, what happens if you don't, right? If things are not changing, they've already changed. And so are you going to be ahead of the curve? Are you going to be ahead of your peers? Or are you going to kind of sit back and see what happens and then risk being farther behind in 10 years? And usually that snaps them into attention.
Right.
And I don't try to change anybody's beliefs because that's not what I'm here for. I'm really here to be that multi-generational lens because yes, it's critical to understand the next generation, but it's equally as important to make sure that we're paying attention to our senior professionals because we do live in a multi-generational workplace. And so that's what I tell leaders. That's what I try to get across.
And what are your best ways to help the youngest, early career professionals really tap into the experiences of the senior leaders? There's tone that can be adapted, which I think can be helpful. And I do think, going back to what you said at the very beginning, it's about self-advocating. Okay, so Gen Xers and Boomers raise their kids to self-advocate until they actually get into the workplace and they don't want them to be talking so much like that anymore. How do you help Gen Zs integrate and communicate better and be able to contribute in ways that are really going to help them show their value and help them be appreciated and part of the conversation in a meaningful way, because what they are bringing, it's fresh eyes to understand how much is changing and, technology savvy and experience and exploration and experimentation. What are your key steps that help them do their part?
Yeah, so you already mentioned a couple of them. And what we found when I first started and took the business full time 3 years ago, I was only talking to C-suite leaders. That was like my main audience.
Right.
And I quickly realized that, well, we can teach them how to communicate with the younger workers, but if we're not teaching the younger workers to also communicate, then
For
it's kind
sure.
of like
Yeah.
this lopsided,
Yeah.
arrangement. And so we created a program that we, help organizations with, and it's an emerging leaders communication training. So
Oh, great.
we do that. We also offer something that has been very recent in the last 6 months or so is trainings for young leaders. And when I heard that, I was like, oh, so emerging leaders, we already have that program. And many companies have said, no, it's young people, like young millennials who have been in the workforce for several years, but now they're leading down and up. They're leading young professionals, and they're also managing people older than them. Millennials take this leadership stage as we have an aging workforce who isn't transferring the skills down quickly enough to them. We really focus on communication styles, right? It's important to acknowledge generational data, but more importantly, people are not the generations box that they belong to. People are individuals. How do we link all of them together? And that's a really big piece of our training at the beginning. And then also the technology component. How do we approach a senior professional with some of our technology prowess in a respectful way? That's a real thing that younger workers kind of need support with. And then even going back to the basics, we have so many clients hire us because they can't get their young people to show up on time. They can't get their people to dress professionally.
Right.
The gap from the pandemic has only exacerbated the assumptions and the knowledge of these younger workers coming into the workforce.
How are you trying to help people connect across that divide? Because it is very hard for some people to really try and put themselves, let's say, in a much younger person's position and say, how different is that? And similarly, if I am 2 years into the labor market and trying to think about some guy, some woman who is 25 years older than me, their experience is so different from something I cannot even imagine because the world was incredibly different and I don't even understand. I've seen it on TV maybe. How do you help them connect just to help people understand like these are the things to be thinking about when they're sitting in a meeting kind of going like, how can I think about this differently?
So a couple of things. One is communication comes down to trust. Let me start by saying trust is broken or never even begun when there is a lack of clear expectations, when there is a misunderstanding, and that typically leads to some type of disconnect. Yeah. How you bridge that is truly through understanding how people communicate, and it's acknowledging how you communicate. It is the most simple tip I can give, yet it changes workforces, Sophie. Like I have a slide and it always, people laugh when I share it, but it's like, ask your team their top communication style. Just people don't, when I ask them like, who's done this? Crickets. And I always say like, that's okay. That's okay. But that is why I get calls from, months, years later from people who say that is the thing I remember most. And it's not the data, right? There's a few data points that really stand out to people, but it's like that specific thing shows me, because we're also able to measure it when you set communication guidelines, but most people have never even asked. And so how crazy when you put pen to paper and I ask, if it's a workshop, I'll have people actually like write out the direct reports. Like, how do they communicate? And a lot of people are like, I actually have no idea. And so there's so much gray area with communication. So what if you could kind of make it black or white? And that is like a very solid tip that I would share that really does go a long way.
When they think about it, there's more to what they know about each person than they have, than's registered. How do you deal with the question of dress? Because this idea of dressing professionally is something that is important on both sides. I know that Gen Zs really care about being able to feel comfortable and what other people are used to. There's a big clash there. And it seems to be quite a culture clash sometimes. How do you deal with that?
So one thing that I will say is Gen Z has so much out there in terms of what's online that there are influencers and, young men and women who are posting things like, here's what I would recommend wearing to the office. And it's a crop top and a short skirt. Like those are actual. So now there's a trend where people are they're clapping back and they're responding and they're like, here's what I would wear. And it's just like concert gear, and they're kind of laughing at it, but there are truly Gen Z members out there who are like absorbing this and thinking like,
that's what I should wear.
So maybe we should wear this. And I talk to lawyers about this. I talk to people on job sites who are showing up in things that you just can't even imagine. And so again, how are you communicating with these people? And are you being clear? Are you setting expectations? And make it I encourage people to make it a part of your hiring process, even before they enter the door. So hey, let's send an email before the interview and let them know what traditional office wear is. I know there might be people who disagree with that, but what I have found is in conversations with younger workers and future young workers, so high schoolers and college students, is they're not learning this at a unified level across colleges, across high school. And so let's be the ones to tell them what the expectation is, because the reality is 30 years ago, everyone wore the same thing to work. Now you've got, tech companies that have a much more laid back feel compared to a financial advisor or a lawyer. And so you have to be clear and you have to set the expectation. I have had clients who we do a lot of work with communication guidelines and expectations and then measuring that. And we include in those guidelines, like if you have a question about attire with clients or your team, like day to day, let us know. But here's the expectation when you're in the office, like business casual means this, this, and this. Right. Again, common sense is not that common anymore. You cannot assume that people know what to wear, and that doesn't make them less hard of a worker. It just means that they might not have the tools in their tool belt. And so can we help them out beforehand?
If that communication is made, particularly before the interview, that when somebody comes to the interview, the person who is doing the interviewing isn't judging the interviewee based on their attire, because that just gets, that puts up a barrier which isn't necessary between them before anybody's got started.
And I am seeing that happen with more experienced professionals as well. I think it's the post-pandemic workplace that we live in. Everybody's gotten a little more casual. I was just talking to somebody the other day who said a Gen Xer, they assumed that this person was Gen X, came in for an executive assistant position and had a sundress, very short. And they said they couldn't even focus on this person because they were like, how can this person be the welcome party for the welcoming committee? And so I think it's a post-pandemic, I think it's a culture shift. So I don't just think it's younger workers.
There is such a range that it's hard for people to make the decision. And sometimes the decision is not what one would expect. Whatever context we came from, we bring that and make some, judgments or assumptions on the about the other person. If someone's having a really difficult time with somebody on their team who's a very different generation to them, what would you just a couple of ideas what they can do tomorrow, next week, to try and shift the dynamic? Because sometimes it's a little bit that can just shift things, and then, a lot more can change.
Pause and ask yourself, how does this person communicate? Does it change? Is it different when things are urgent? How can I communicate with them? Do I know that answer? If not, maybe worth having a conversation. That trust that we talked about earlier, that can really be built when you ask that question. set the expectation on how you communicate as a leader, right? If you're struggling with communicating with somebody or just any kind of challenge, assess that, do that kind of communication audit, if you will. And then look at the resources available. There's plenty of data out there. And so ask yourself, what would happen if I took some of this data and I leveraged some of this data for my day-to-day communication?
Good idea.
And so it goes back to just being really curious. And I think you said it best. It's like a lot of times people already know how these people communicate, but people don't think about it. And so I guarantee you, if you just ask, you're going to have this whole new level of communication open up. And I think that can be really powerful.
It's been a great, great conversation. You have shared so many insights and a huge focus on expectations. And I think it's so valuable to be sharing that and really putting a huge emphasis on it, because I think often we don't actually know what expectations we have until they're not met. So really having clarity, a lot of self-reflection and better self-understanding so that then we can communicate more clearly to the people who we're working with, who are part of our team. I think it's incredibly beneficial. So thank you so much, Kamber. Really appreciate your time and your insights.
Thank you, Sophie.
Thanks again so much to Kamber Parker Bowden, CEO and founder of Generational Performance Solutions. You can find out more about Kamber on LinkedIn, as well as go to the website at genperformance.com, genperformance.com. Immediate action tip to improve how you lead a multi-generational team. Build trust. Set clear expectations. And ask your team their top communication style. If you are finding the new business and work environment hard to navigate, contact me for board advice, executive mentorship, courses, and workshops that enable multi-generational distributed leaders, managers, and teams to up-level and scale rapidly in the modern work environment and be ready for whatever lies ahead. If you enjoyed this episode, please like it and share it with a friend. You can also write a quick review wherever you listen or watch. For regular news, video, articles, research, and information, follow me on LinkedIn and sign up for my Work in Progress newsletter there. Thanks for watching. Until next time.